If you're a product manager, a marketing manager, or just someone who's struggling with your Amplitude analytics data, then this is the video for you. I'm going to cover 15 issues that can affect and ruin your Amplitude data, and I'll give you solutions for each of the 15 issues. This is going to go from the more simple issues to really tricky and advanced issues. I have seen all of them over the past 10 years working with over 100 organizations, helping them with tools like Amplitude. So with all that being said, let's jump right in. Issue number 1, event names don't make any sense. Now, I've spoken about this extensively in my channel and other videos, but before you implement any data in Amplitude, you really have to make sure that you create a tracking plan and you think through what the event names, the event properties, and the user properties will look like. At the most basic level, you want all of these things to be logical. So if you have an action in your app where a user can make a purchase, the correspondent event for this action will likely be called purchase. And then under the event properties, you're going to have things like the name of the product that's being purchased, the revenue amount, the tax amount, the shipping amount, and so forth. Now, I shared a link to a tracking plan in previous videos. I can show you here. You can see this link in the description below. But basically, this is a tracking plan. I give examples here. For example, this is a tracking plan for an e-commerce site based on the existing retailer called Indochino. The main point we want to make note is that the event names are logical, right? Once you know that this is an e-commerce site, you can look at an event like checkout started, and you can instantly think, oh yeah, I kind of know what this event is. Or for example, they enter the payment info, likely in the checkout. And of course, order completed will be that purchase event I spoke about before. And if you look at the event properties, they're all logical. Checkout ID, order ID, the step number, affiliation value, and so forth. So this is what you want to do with all your data. So if your existing data doesn't have this, if you look at some event names and you have no idea what they mean, you have two options. One, the more radical option, is to simply re-implement everything that you have done so far. This is going to be a lot of work. But it can vary depending on how much existing data you have. Some teams don't really have a lot of data, or they don't particularly care about the historical data because they know it's not going to be that helpful. So they're open and willing to simply re-implement everything following a much more structured process, such as using a tracking plan before you write any code. Step number 2, if you do have historical data you want to keep, it's simply renaming the events inside the Amplitude interface. Let me show you how. So we're here in the data section here in Amplitude. We know we have events, we have properties, and so on. I'm just kind of filtering down by events here. And you can see that, this event, of course, makes sense. But for the purpose of our examples, we can take any event that exists in Amplitude, like this one. And then here, we can actually go up here and then rename it, right? Just simply add whatever we want. So we might call this, I don't know, for example, all users, just in case we want to. And as you do that, you see that Amplitude will actually add this little subtitle here where it tells you that the ingested name is content completed, but now this will appear as content completed all users anywhere in the interface. So all the dropdowns, all the reports. So this is a handy way to take whatever you're ingesting, which may not be that useful, and turn it into something that actually makes more sense within the interface. Now, one clear downside of this approach is if you have 20, 30, 40 events, this may be quite a bit of work to rename all the events, perhaps even rename all the properties. So this may not be viable for all situations, but maybe through a combination of re-implementation and renaming in the interface, you can kind of get down to a group of events that make sense, that are logical, and that have all the properties that you need. Number 2, I can't slice or dice the data. Now, this all comes down to event properties. So you have events. We saw those event properties in the tracking plan. So ideally, you need to have them in your events themselves to be able to slice the data. So if we have data here in Amplitude, this is a demo account, and we look at, for example, the complete free trial event, we have the event counts, but then in the group by, we'll have event properties. In this case, we have 4 event properties here, the product line, trial length, country, event hour, and so on. And the ones that have the Amplitude logo are actually default properties, which I'll show you in a second. So as long as you have them, for example, trial length, then you're able to, of course, slice and dice your data as you see fit. So if you're not able to do the slicing that you want to do, it's likely because the relevant event property might not actually exist at the event level, and you need to add it. Let me show you one more report here just so you can see those event properties. So if we open any profile here in Amplitude, and then we go into an event. Once again, in this event, for example, we have 3 event properties: the object type, previous step, product line, and actually there are several other properties that Amplitude is bringing in, such as the platform, the device type, the country, the region, the city, and so forth. Although these ones actually that do not have the Amplitude logo are also custom, such as the gender, the trial users, and so forth. So generally, if you cannot slice and dice as you fit, you need to go back to your developer and ask them to add the necessary event properties to do that slicing. Number 3, I cannot see country, region, or device information. Now, this is typically something that Amplitude captures by default. If you're using the client SDKs, that means the JavaScript, the iOS, or the Android SDKs. So if we look at the documentation here for a second, we can see that the way Amplitude gathers, for example, the region, the country, and the city is it actually grabs the IP address of the user right here, and it converts it into a city, a country, a region, and actually something else called DMA. Now, if you made no changes to the client-side SDKs, this will happen automatically. You can actually disable it if you have privacy concerns. I work with some companies, for example, that they want no kind of PII information in their data, so we disable the IP address collection, and Amplitude never sees it. Now, we also have to make a note about the accuracy about this process, right? So we're converting IP address into corresponding region, country, and city. So Amplitude uses a company called MaxMind, and actually MaxMind has this helpful chart to show you what is the general accuracy of this conversion. You can see that, in many cases, we're talking about 80, 90%, perhaps even higher. And if you go down to perhaps the main countries you might look at, such as, interesting enough, the US is actually about 67%. So that's kind of intriguing. I would expect that to be higher. The UAE is 93 and so forth. So you may have, depending on your customer base, some lower accuracy in the conversion of a region, country, and city. But again, from the standpoint of a technical implementation, as long as it's being collected automatically, then you will have this information. Now, a second issue that could arise is if you're not using the client-side SDKs and you don't have this automatic process, perhaps you're using some kind of backend SDK. In that case, you actually need to manually pass this. So we're here in this documentation for this is the HTTP version 2 API, so the most sort of basic backend SDK Amplitude has. And we can see all the different things we can pass into it, user ID, device ID. But down here, we have something for IP, and it's just called IP, all lowercase. And again, we pass the IP address of the user, and then Amplitude will use this, run it through that MaxMind database, and convert it to region, country, and city. So if you're using a backend SDK, just make sure that you're passing an actual IP address for the user, and then typically Amplitude will convert that for you. Issue number 4, the data is wrong or I cannot trust it. Now, this is one of the most common issues I see with my clients. They simply do not trust the data that they're seeing in front of them. It's a few things you have to do, and you sort of have to work through the debugging process and bring back some confidence in the data. So let me show you an example here. Some of the things I do when I get this kind of question. First, I want to understand if there's any kind of technical issue that could be affecting the data. Here's an event called user sign up. And right now we're just looking at, let's say, the event totals here. So we see, spikes and dips in the user sign up, but we want to understand, is there some kind of technical issue that could be affecting this number? Perhaps the number is too high or too little. One of the first things I do is actually just look at the averages. So I can see that the average here is actually 1.08, and it kind of hovers at the 1.08, 1.010, which means that about 10% of the users, give or take, are actually firing the user sign up more than once, typically twice. Now, this may be okay in this use case. This company may say, yeah, we have some cases where users sign up multiple times, where maybe they have an issue signing up, and then they have to get support to help them, so they have a duplicate event firing. Okay. If not, though, then this will be a bit of a red flag. To have a 10% of the users who are firing the event twice is typically some kind of technical issue that we want to resolve. We may have a lower number here, for example. We may see that if we start to break this down, if we go back to event totals, and we start to break this down, let's say by OS, we may not see enough data for Android or iOS or Chrome or something like that. So it may be entire segments that are not there that we want to actually then figure out what's going on with them. You also need a secondary source here. So in this case, for a user sign up, your secondary source might be something like your product database, and you can see exactly how many users created an account over a period, let's say the last 30 days. Let's say you have 10,000 signups on your product database, but you only have 8,000 on your Amplitude data. Then we want to start to figure out where could that missing 2000 be? Could it be ad blockers, right? Could that be the main issue? If we were to do some kind of backend tracking, are we going to have more data than just client-side tracking? Could it be any technical issue that's affecting Amplitude in some browsers, and so forth? So we just want to work through all the potential issues that could be affecting the accuracy and bring back that confidence. And there's no real formula here. There's no secret. You just have to go through all the potential use cases of this is client-side data or backend data. This is a missing issue, or this is typically an issue. There's an error being created here, and work through those issues and bring back some high level of accuracy. Now, your accuracy may not be 100%. It may be, let's say, 95% of your product database, but that's okay. Amplitude is great for directional data, so it doesn't need 100% of data or 100% of accuracy, but it should have a high level, somewhere in the mid 90s to high 90s of accuracy. Issue number 5, funnels are broken. Now, funnels is one of my favorite reports in Amplitude. It's very helpful, but sometimes you build it and you think it kind of looks right, but then you look at the data and it doesn't make sense. So for example, here we have a funnel that's clearly broken, right? We have 87,000 users on the first step and only 0 users on the second step. Now you'll notice in our demo data that the steps here, of course, don't make any sense. Typically the sign up should be before the actual free trial. So I'm kind of breaking the funnel on purpose just to show you how a broken funnel typically looks like. So you may have a 0% conversion rate. That's a clear sign that there's an issue. Or the conversion rate may be just way too low. You may be expecting a 20-30% conversion rate, but you're seeing a 1% conversion rate. So there's clearly an issue in the data itself. So to understand that, we have to go to look at the profiles in Amplitude. So if you open this profile here, this is what it typically looks like. You have properties on the left-hand side. And of course, you have lots of properties, right? This is all demo data. And then you have the list of events in the center of this user, broken down by session and broken down by device. So success from an implementation perspective simply means that all the events the user can do across any device should appear in a single page. And you can test it yourself, right? You can create a test user using a test email. You go through the sign up, you go through the trial, you go through the onboarding, you watch videos or whatever it is your app does. And then you go find your profile in Amplitude using your email or using the user ID you created. You can ask your developers for that user ID if you don't know it. Open the profile in Amplitude. First, the profile should be there. If it's not there, then you really have to think about, is there ad blockers or is there something else that's limiting the data? But you open the profile, assuming it's there, and then you go through all the events that you fired, and you should see everything that you did. So you should see the signups, the trials, the video watching, whatever actions you took, they should be here. And of course, if you want to go one step further, then all the event properties that you want to see should also be here. This is what debugging basically looks like at the end when you are successful in implementing everything in Amplitude. If you don't see the events, you may have broken profiles, and you may need to ask your developer to connect profiles. One common situation is typically any activity that happens before the sign up. So when you first land on the website, you might read a blog post or the pricing page. All this activity is happening anonymously, and then it needs to be connected to the known Amplitude data once you sign up. You can do this through the amplitude.identify in the documentation and any SDK. But again, success is just having all the events in a single profile, regardless of whether they happen before you signed up or after you signed up or on any other device. Even, if you open your phone, let's say, and you log into the app and you go through a bunch of events, those events should then appear in the Amplitude profile connected under the same user. Once you do, then when you redo your funnel with new data, it should roughly look something like this. We can now see that this funnel is, a 20% conversion rate. That's kind of in line with what we expect. Great. So now the funnel makes sense, and now we can continue our analysis in this report. Issue number 6, Amplitude is not tracking across domains. Now, the first thing we want to know here is when we talk about cross-domain tracking, we're talking about 2 different domains. For example, example.com and example.ca. These are completely different domains. We are not talking about subdomains. If you have something like email.example.com or calendar.example.com, all of this are completely fine. It all depends on cookies, and typically cookies are set at the top level domain. So any subdomain can read those cookies, and then Amplitude is completely fine. However, if you do have cross domains, and the most common scenario here is typically some kind of payment processor. So your website is on example.com, but users have to go to paypal.com to complete the payment and then come back into Amplitude. So in that case, we need to do cross-domain tracking. And cross-domain tracking effectively boils down to several steps. Amplitude actually has a great documentation here in the browser SDK. Typically, this happens on the client-side level. If you're doing backend tracking, this may actually be not an issue at all. But if you're seeing it and you're using the client-side SDKs, then we can actually look at the cross-domain tracking here. And we'll kind of look at the steps here. So step one, we want to grab the device ID from the user and the session ID as well. So these are two IDs that Amplitude generates automatically whenever the SDK loads on the website. So there's a couple JavaScript calls we can get to get a device ID, get the session ID, and then we want to append them into the URL of the second domain. This is step number 2 here, as you can see. So we're going to end up with URL parameters. In this case, Amplitude is looking for something very specific. They're looking for the AMP device ID, and they're looking for session ID as the URL parameter names. And then, of course, you're passing the actual value that you pulled in step 1. And then in step 2, in the second domain, then you initialize the SDK with those values being automatically pulled into the SDK. So actually what you're doing here is that you initialize the SDK with a null value. And as we can see here, the SDK will automatically fall back to using the URL parameters respectively. So that's kind of nice, right? So we don't need to tweak the code of the second side too much. We can just kind of fall back on those parameters. Now, of course, this will probably go back to the first domain as well. That is, when the user goes from the second domain to the first domain, you likely need to go through the same steps. So typically, from a JavaScript perspective, you write a little function that pulls that device ID and the session ID from the code, appends any URLs of that second domain that exists on the website, and then you tweak the JavaScript SDK, how it initializes to make sure that all of these URL parameters are respected, and you do this in the second domain as well. That is typically how cross-domain works. It's not a very complex process. You just want to make sure the timing is correct, and of course that you're pulling those two IDs respectively, and that you're naming them correctly. For Amplitude to pull them from the URL parameter, they need to be named in a very specific way. Issue number 7, UTM tags are not being captured. Now, UTM tags are the most common way that marketers typically track their campaigns and the performance of those campaigns. These are tags such as UTM campaign, UTM source, UTM medium, and so forth. There's about 5 that are core, and these days you might see maybe up to 10 different ones. Now, again, if we're using the client-side SDK, Amplitude can actually track this by default. So if it's not doing this, you want to double check it. If we go back to the documentation here, we can see that we actually have the ability to track marketing attribution by default. So this is part of the sort of auto capture that Amplitude offers. And Amplitude will collect these 5 core UTMs: the source, the medium, the campaign, the term, and the content. It will also grab the refer and the refer domain, which is just really helpful. And it will grab a bunch of click IDs, whether the Facebook click ID, the Google click ID, and actually Google Ads typically today has 3 IDs. Coachella, LinkedIn, Microsoft, and so forth. And then Amplitude will create special event properties and user properties for the initial UTMs right here, initial referring domains, initial G-clicks, and so on. And it will capture the last ones. So effectively, you can do first touch attribution, you can do last touch, and if you take your data out to some kind of BigQuery data warehouse stuff, you can then do some kind of multi-touch attribution if you really wanted to. And again, all this really means is on the auto capture settings, when you initialize the SDK, you set this to true. The initial value is true. You just want to double check that is the case in your implementation. Now, if you're not using the client SDKs, if you're going for all backend tracking, and this kind of makes sense today to avoid ad blockers and other issues, then you simply have to do this work yourself. You have to look at a URL, extract the URL parameters, and of course, any kind of click IDs. You may not want to do all the click IDs, but you maybe want to do the Facebook click ID, the Google Ads click ID, and anything else that you're actually using. So in your backend code, you then want to write some logic that searches for these URL parameters if they exist. It grabs them, and then you do the same logic. You have some initial UTM values, initial click IDs, and then you have some last touch UTM values, last touch click IDs. So it's a little bit more work to do on the back end. The work is not impossible, and it's typically something you do once and it will just keep working going forward. But just make a note. The client SDK will do it automatically for you, and the backend SDKs may require some manual work on your end. Issue number 8. Profile properties are not being saved. Now, this is a minor point. If you're trying to pass profile properties and they're not being saved, double check your code. I'm going to show you here just what this might look like, for example, on the browser SDK. So typically, we have this Amplitude identifier that we're kind of building. We have an ability to set properties. So we're setting here a property called location.la. This, of course, you might notice might be a duplicate of the city default property Amplitude has, but you may want it in a different value. Nonetheless, you can set it. There's actually a set once. So this avoids overriding the same value over and over again. So if you have a value that you only want to set once at all, an example is actually what we just saw before with those initial UTM values. So we want to capture the very initial UTMs, set those using set once, and they'll never get overwritten because we want to store them forever. We can, of course, add. This allows you to increment integers. We can prepend and we can append as well. So just to note, the general structure here is, you fire the identify, you set the property, you set once, you prepend, you append, and then you of course fire the event itself. So I would just double check your code to make sure that you're following this basic structure to make sure that you set in profile properties correctly within the Amplitude interface. Issue number 9, opt-out tracking is not working. So users can opt out of tracking, and of course we see this much more in the European Union. There's some states in the US that are trying to pass privacy laws, but generally Amplitude does have an option to do this. So if you open the client SDK, we do actually have this specific function called set out opt out, and we can set it to true, and then from that moment Amplitude will no longer send any events for that specific user. So you can set this. Perhaps you may have a cookie banner, and if the user rejects that cookie banner, then you fire the set opt out to prevent the user from being tracked. If you're doing this on the back end, then you kind of have to replicate the same logic and find a way to track if the user has opt out. And if they do, then you kind of pass a similar flag and you don't send any data for that specific user. You can, of course, make it false to re-trigger the data. So the client SDK is perhaps the easiest way of doing it. I will also note that you may need a cookie consent tool. So this is just an article that looks at some of the most popular consent tools out there. I'm just going to quickly scroll down here. Things like Osano. There is Quantcast, Cookie Yes, which I've used myself, CookieBot, which I've also used, TrustArc. So there's a few consent managers. Typically, this allows you to build that cookie prompt. It may allow you to build a more complex cookie prompt where perhaps users can say yes to some cookies, but not to others. And many of these tools can then actually integrate with specific analytics tools, for example, Amplitude, Mixpanel, Segment.com, and so forth. So this may actually make your opt-out a little bit more automated. Nonetheless, there's lots of different ways of allowing users to opt out and then having the Amplitude SDKs respect that automatically. Issue number 10, ad blockers are limiting our data. Now, this is a very common issue. It's been an issue now for several years, and it just continues to get more common. The percentage of data that might be blocked by an ad blocker will vary greatly depending on who your audience is. For example, right now I'm working with a couple of fitness companies, and typically the percentage of data that we see limited by ad blockers might be about 5%. It's very small. But in the past, I have worked with, let's say, a security company. That's a company that makes software for the security industry. And the amount of ad blockers we saw there was closer to 40%. This is a few years ago. I wouldn't be surprised if the number is closer to 50% or 60% today. So once you get to those levels, this is a pretty significant issue and can really affect the quality of the data you're tracking. We talked multiple times about moving away from client-side to backend tracking, which is really the long-term solution. So you may eventually use the browser SDK less and less. You may keep it for some things like UTM tags and some of the other things we have seen so far, but you slowly move to a backend tracking to deal with the ad blockers issues. So Amplitude has an entire article about this. And typically what this means is instead of loading the Amplitude SDK through the amplitude.com, which is typically going to be blocked by ad blockers, you're going to load it through your own domain. Let's say, your domain.com/amplitude. And this typically is not blocked by ad blockers themselves because it's coming from your own domain. So setting up a proxy does require some technical expertise. I'm not going to go through all the steps, but generally, there's some sort of backend work that needs to happen, but you still maintain the client-side tracking, the browser SDK for a lot of what you do. So sometimes this sort of proxy domain is helpful as an in-between solution. If you want to move to the backend, but you don't have resources right now, perhaps you set up the domain proxy and get this working, and that helps you deal with ad blockers over the medium term while you think about that long-term solution. One of my favorite solutions is actually to use Google Tag Manager. So you may be highly familiar with the client-side version of Google Tag Manager, very powerful. But there's also a server-side component or equivalent. And the server-side tagging actually allows you to load the client-side version of GTM through a proxy. So it kind of helps you build your own proxy under your own domain. So you're able to maintain the power of the client-side Google Tag Manager while actually introducing the capability of using server-side Google Tag Manager, which can also be helpful for sending backend conversions, particularly to Amplitude, but also to something like a Facebook ads, Google ads, and so forth. So this is actually one of my favorite solutions because it allows us to do the proxy while keeping all the functionality of Google Tag Manager and move into more of a backend conversion setup through Google Tag Manager. So if this is something that might be a good fit, check it out. Both products are, of course, free from Google, and they tend to work quite similar. Just, of course, the server-side containers typically require a little bit more setup than the client-side containers, but I find that setup to be quite worth it over the long run. Issue 11, we don't have any historical data. Now, this is very common. Typically, when you implement Amplitude, it means that whatever data is in Amplitude is whatever will be available after your implementation. But you may have multiple years of data. I work with companies that may have 2, 3, 4 years of some data, maybe not all of it, but they most likely have the core events, the signups, when users started trials, when they made purchases, things like that. And they may want to bring it in. Now, luckily, Amplitude supports this. So if we open a special article Amplitude has on data backfill, this is a possibility. Typically, you do it using the special batch event upload API. And the general process here is you want to grab all your historical data from wherever it is, typically some database in your product. You want to then tweak around that data so it fits the actual structure that Amplitude expects. And if we go down here, it will kind of look something like this. So it's some kind of JSON object that contains all the relevant information for that event. We may pass the user ID. There's special things like this insert ID, which is just this identifier that gets generated for each event. You may have device IDs, content types, user properties. You may not have everything you're tracking right now, but you may have some of it. That's okay. So you take all your data from your existing database, you run it through some kind of script to convert it to this JSON object. And then you send it to the Amplitude API. When you pass the date, the timestamp of the event, you can pass a timestamp in the past. Keep in mind the timestamp has to be done in a UTC time zone, but you can pass a timestamp in the past of, let's say, a year ago, 2 years ago, and then Amplitude will respect that. And when it ingests the data, it will simply structure the events of wherever they happen in the past. So again, generally pretty straightforward. The trickier part is just seeing what kind of data you do have and converting that through that JSON object that Amplitude expects. But once you do that, sending it to Amplitude and having Amplitude ingest it and then show it in the interface is quite straightforward. One more note here, just is depending on your pricing plan, you may not be able to look at multiple years worth of data. For example, I believe some of the lower Amplitude pricing plans, you can only look at a maximum of 12 months as a date range. You can look at any 12 months. So you could go 12 months in the past, of course. You can look at 12 months of 2021, but you might not be able to do 2021 to 2024, which will be 3 years worth of data. So just double check your pricing plan as well before you do any kind of historical data backfill, depending on what you want to do with the data. Issue number 12, integrations don't work. Now, this is a pretty broad issue because there's lots of ways of thinking about integration. So let's actually break them down in 2 categories, sources and destinations. So here we have sources. So as the name implies, this is our integrations that bring data into Amplitude. Some of them are straightforward. Let's say something like Facebook ads. Then you have mobile attribution providers like AppsFlyer, Adjust. You may have CDPs like Segment, and of course, there's a bunch of other ones. Typically, sources require a couple things. First, to connect data from a source to Amplitude, there needs to be some kind of unifying ID. The most common unifying ID tends to be the device ID. So for example, for AppsFlyer, if we open this, typically, when AppsFlyer initializes as the SDK in your mobile app, we have to then pass the Amplitude device ID, which means that actually Amplitude has to initialize before AppsFlyer. So Amplitude initializes first. We get the device ID from Amplitude. We actually saw this device ID in the cross-domain tracking. We then give AppsFlyer the device ID, and typically this means that AppsFlyer has a custom way to set user IDs, a custom user ID. So the custom user ID in AppsFlyer will be the Amplitude device ID. And then whenever AppsFlyer does its thing, it will do attribution. It will fire some kind of event called install attributed with information of where that install came from. That event can then be sent to Amplitude, and because it has the same device ID, then Amplitude is able to connect that in a profile in a single way, just like we saw in the previous issue. So this is one of the most common ways that you connect sources to Amplitude. So there's some kind of connecting ID between them. Again, device ID tends to be the most common. Some of them don't use the concept of device ID, so you may need email. You can think of some email platforms like a MailChimp and so on, where what they're looking for is the actual email, so you want to double check that. Some actually use user IDs. I can think about Braze, for example. They have a concept of external ID, is what they call it in their world. And then typically the external ID will then match the user ID. But again, you kind of have to double check the documentation for each source and see what is needed to make that integration work. Some sources don't have any connection whatsoever. I can think of Facebook ads as a good example. So typically Facebook ads, there are steps to be able to set this up. That is, you have to go get special IDs or tokens or things like that from Facebook. But then when you bring data into Facebook, the Facebook data itself is not really connected to any user because the Facebook data does not have user level data. That is, when Facebook gives you data, it's giving you data about a campaign, the cost, the clicks. It's breaking down this data by day or perhaps hour, but there's no user identifiers that Amplitude can use. So you're not going to be able to say, here's a user, and then they click this ad, and then they convert it with this ad according to Facebook. You're not going to get that level of granularity. But you're still going to have the data in Amplitude, which can be really helpful, because then you can build a few reports using the Facebook data and do it all within Amplitude, kind of keep things consolidated. Now we have destinations. Destinations, that's a little bit more complexity, but some of the principles actually still apply. So just like before, we might see similar integrations here. Here's Facebook ads, here's Google ads. And actually, this is a good example here. Google ads has two options, cohort sync and event stream. So cohort sync means that you're actually syncing the cohorts inside Amplitude. So a cohort simply means it's a group of users that you define based on some criteria. For example, maybe you build a cohort for recent signups over the last 30 days. And you're doing this based on an event called user sign up, which we saw in some of our demo data. And as long as a user fires this event sometime in the last 30 days, then this is a cohort. This concept exists in many tools. Some tools calls them segments or lists. Amplitude calls them cohorts. So a cohort sync means that Amplitude is going to sync the number of users in that cohort with the destination on some kind of frequency, let's say hourly or daily. So for Google Ads, it means that it's going to send the cohort to Google Ads, and this will become an audience that you can then choose in Google Ads and then run campaigns against. Now you can see there are several things that need to be enabled here to make this cohort sync work. This might be some exclusive to Google Ads, but they tend to vary depending on the integration. So this is one option for destination integrations, just syncing a cohort sync. And again, just imagine that you're really syncing simply a list of users. And this may be a list of user IDs or user emails, depending on the integration. So if you have 1,000 users in a cohort, then Amplitude is going to sync that list of 1,000 users, 1,000 IDs, 1,000 emails, every hour, every day, whatever it is. The second option is event stream. An event stream, as the name implies, it actually means you're syncing the events themselves. So if you're firing 20 events into Amplitude, user sign up, completed trial, content completed, watch video, whatever, then the event stream integration allows you to sync all those events into the destination itself. So in terms of Google Ads, this means that we can send the actual event with the event properties to Google Ads. And in this case, these events will become conversions inside Google Ads. If we send them to somewhere like Braze or MailChimp, then they'll become events themselves, depending on how that integration thinks about events. So events is quite extensive because we're sending all of the event payload, all the event properties and user properties that are correspondent to that event. And of course, we're sending perhaps multiple events. So we may be sending thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of events with an event stream. So you want to double think that as well. Just like before, there might be specific requirements for an integration. For example, Google Ads, you need the G-click to make this work. We did, if you remember, the browser SDK can actually collect the G-click for you automatically. So that can be really helpful. And again, depending on what we have as a destination, you double check the settings. Some of them only have cohort syncs. Some of them only have event streams, and some of them have both, depending on how the destination has been set up. So again, there's no specific answer, but going back to sources as well, typically the way the data is connected to a destination also comes down to some kind of user ID or device ID, just making sure that those destinations use the same concept. So if you have device ID or user ID, or in some cases, email as the identifier, you want to make sure those are the same. And then that allows Amplitude to sync cohorts or to do the event stream automatically. So very helpful to have sources and destinations. I can actually see that Amplitude has sort of built sort of a light version of a CDP, a customer data platform, and they're adding lots of destinations. It's typically less than what something like Segment.com or mParticle has, or RudderStack today. But it can be helpful if the destinations or sources that you care about are in this list. You just have to make sure that you have all the prerequisites to make them work. Issue 13. Lifecycle doesn't work. Now, I mentioned this just because it's one of my favorite reports, the Lifecycle report. It actually gives you an entire retention framework to think about your users. I actually have another video where I talk about Lifecycle, so check that out. Nonetheless, the videos, the groups here, the new users, current users, resurrected users, dormant users, may not make any sense to you right away. So I actually recommend that you check out this. This is the retention playbook Amplitude wrote a few years ago now, and it's all available online. You can see the different chapters. And then here it gives you a good way to think about the lifecycle framework and how it makes sense. I would actually recommend you read the entire book. So it will show you how to think about retention, what those categories mean, and then what the numbers actually mean for your product, especially things like polls, which I think is a handy metric for understanding retention. So read the playbook first, and then go back to the lifecycle report, and I think it starts to make a little more sense. But I think it's a fantastic report for understanding retention. It's built in an easy way that's already sort of broken apart for you. And if you make a few tweaks, you can make it really actionable for your team. Number 14, invalid ID length for user ID or device ID. I have actually faced this issue a couple times. So if you're passing a user ID or a device ID into Amplitude, there is actually a minimum length that ID needs to be. If we open the documentation here, in one of the HTTP APIs, we can see actually that the minimum length is 5 characters or more. So the issue here might be if for some reason in your product database, you start your user IDs at a single digit, a single number, for example, 1, 2, 3, and then you have users who have a user ID of 8 or 11 or 25, which is possible. If that's the case, then you're going to run into issues with Amplitude. So you want to think about how to deal with this minimum length issue dependent on your user ID table. Now, not every company does this, and this hasn't been as common. It's happened a couple times, but it's definitely a rare occurrence. Most product databases typically start user IDs with at least 5, 6, 8 digits, and then they go from there. But just something to keep in mind if that's your setup. Issue 15, we cannot see more than 12 months worth of data. Now, again, I've also seen this issue, especially with companies on the lower Amplitude pricing plans. This depends on the pricing itself. Let me show you that here. So Amplitude has a sort of straightforward pricing. There's a free plan that has up to 50K MTUs at the time of this recording. And then there's a plus plan that depends on your monthly tracked users. These users will include known users and anonymous users. So if you have 100,000 users who come to your website every month, but only 10% of them create an account, you're still tracking the 100,000 users. You can tweak this dependent on how you set up your tracking, but generally this is how monthly track users break down. If we scroll down to the platform and data management, we can see some of the limits that you might face when it comes to building charts. For example, you can only have 10 saved charts in the free plan compared to unlimited. Data access, which is what we're referring to here, is 1 year. Now, typically Amplitude will actually store the data for an unlimited amount of time. So it's typically not an issue of Amplitude deleting your data after 1 year. But from the perspective of building a report, so let's say a segmentation, then you're not going to be able to do it for more than 12 months. So if that's the case, then you need to likely upgrade to a pay plan where you might have 2 years, or another plan where you might have longer than that. I also want to show you some limits on the charts themselves. So even regardless of where you are in terms of plan, you can see here that the real-time data has about a maximum range of 1 day. The hourly is 7 days. Daily is 365 days. Weekly is 52 weeks. Monthly, 36 months. And quarterly is 12 quarters. Again, depending on what kind of data access you have, you can play around with this. Your data access will, of course, limit what you can do, let's say, with the monthly and the quarterly ranges nonetheless. And that's all I have for today. These were 15 issues that affect Amplitude data. Some are pretty simple, some are pretty advanced, but I hope you found at least some of them useful. My name is Ruben Ugarte. Now this video is an advanced Amplitude debug tutorial, but I would highly recommend that you check out the next video, which actually shows you how to break down data into insights. This is actually one of the most popular videos in my channel. So look for that right here. I think it's gonna pop up right there for you. I think this will be a fantastic video to go from now you have data, the data makes sense, you have the data you need, how do you actually convert this into actionable insights that you can use in your product? Until next time, we'll talk soon.